Well, thank you all for coming. My name is Jasper Fanning. I'm the General Manager of the Upper Republican Natural Resources District in Imperial, Nebraska. We were one of the districts that was part of developing the N-CORPE project and implementing that over the last couple of years. Basically, the N-CORPE project, as we call it, is, as you can see from the title slide, is a cooperative effort between the three main NRDs in the Republican, the Upper, Middle, and Lower Republican Natural Resources Districts, and the Twin Platte Natural Resources District. And if we can advance. Basically, it's an augmentation project that's designed to supplement flows in both the Platte River Basin and in the Republican River Basin. The Platte River Basin, the Twin Platte NRD, is using the project to meet the goals in their integrated management plan, some conjunctive management goals that essentially assist with the Platte River Recovery Program. And in the Republican Basin, it's mostly for compact compliance. If you look at the location of the project, which is in southern Lincoln County, there where that star is at, roughly about 20 miles southwest of North Platte, Prudential in the early 80s developed about 16,000 acres altogether that the owner we purchased the property from. Was located just north of the headwaters of Medicine Creek. You can see the basin boundary there. The yellow is the Republican Basin. The white would be the Platte River Basin. We bought roughly 15 irrigation wells, and about 5 of those irrigation wells lie in the Platte Drainage Basin, and about 110 of them lie in the Republican River Basin. So it's kind of nice to say that someday water from the Republican watershed will be helping right the ship in the Platte, or at least that's what I like to say when the Twin Platte's not around to give me a hard time the other way. So you see the outline in red there. That's the farm property that we bought. Again, 115 irrigated pivots, a large chunk of it in one contiguous block. That was the Prudential development that occurred in the early 80s. Here you see kind of the schematic of the layout of the well field. The red lines are the wells that are currently online. There's 30 wells. That's the pipeline that ties the dots that are the wells together. We use the existing irrigation wells and drop submersible pumps in them. The blue lines represent future expandability. We could bring about 10 more wells online if the capacity if we ever needed to pump more water in a shorter period of time. The location's fairly unique in southern Lincoln County. There's about 400 to 600 feet of saturated thickness on the property. You can see the little green area there in southern Lincoln County. That's a groundwater rise that's occurred over time from the canals of NPPD and the Platte River projects. And the farm's just on the south edge of that rise area. There you can see in July of 2013, the drought index from the CSD publication shows that it was pretty darn dry in 2013 in south central Nebraska. And in spite of that, in the area that we're talking about, you can see that there was very little change in groundwater levels in southern Lincoln County in spite of the drought of 2012, and it was extremely dry in that area in 2013. In fact, you see one little yellow area in southern Lincoln County here where there was a slight rise in groundwater levels. Well, that's where we retired 30 pivots and basically didn't pump any water in 2013, or very little water to establish a cover crop right there in that area. And so the retirement that we had and the dry weather resulted in a pretty stable water level over the last year. Here you can see a schematic that shows that rise area and how the farm is right essentially on the edge of that rise area where water levels have come up over time. And again, we have about 30 wells, so we're pumping a lot more water out of the wells that we're actually using, but over time should pump no more than what's been used for irrigation, and certainly with some other things that I'll talk about later, maybe even quite a little bit less. Again, here if you look from spring of 13 to spring of 14, the main well field is in an area that saw little to no change. The real purpose of the N-CORPE project for the Republican districts is to facilitate compact compliance through our integrated management plans. And again, for Twin Platte, it's for them to comply with their IMP, which is centered around meeting the requirements of the Platte River Recovery Program, as well as the over-appropriated areas of their district along the Platte River to return that back to fully appropriated. And so the project for Twin Platte, they're working on some legislation that will allow them to borrow some cheap money to make their costs less than what they would be if they had to borrow money in the open market. And they're hopeful that they can basically release that portion of the project for bids next summer. How does it all work together in terms of how does the N-CORPE project and our integrated management planning to work together? Basically, in the Republican Basin, the IMPs contain a requirement for DNR to forecast how much Republican River water we can use under the compact and what our forecasted supplies and accounting look like. And then the requirement is on the NRDs to balance the books for a given year. If the department forecasts a shortfall, which they have the last 3 years, the NRD has several different options to choose from. We can implement projects, retire irrigated acres, do things that would put additional water in the stream through projects, or we could turn, if we chose not to take on projects such as N-CORPE, we could utilize regulation. And we had some choices with respect to how we could regulate to do that. Either we could reduce all pumping by all wells by about 60%, or we could shut off only the wells in the dry years when we needed to that had a significant and more rapid impact, what we call the rapid response area, in those dry years. Or we could do a combination of both and or projects and regulations all together. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that worked out, but sustainably managing the compact allocation is all about adaptive management for the long term, where we ratchet back pumping to offset any lag effects, deal with local issues such as groundwater declines, and then we monitor the compact accounting through the forecast mechanism in the IMPs. And since surface water is already limited in drought times, the NRDs all chose to go with projects and regulating a small number of wells in the rapid response area so that the NRDs could make up any projected shortfall. And compliance by definition is sustainable, because if we're in compliance, that means Nebraska is using less of its share of the Republican River water than what it's entitled to use, or no more than what it's entitled to use. So you know, in a strict sense, as long as we're in compliance, we're not using more than our share of the water supply. And when we're looking at these projects like N-CORPE, you know, we're looking at the big picture. Irrigated agriculture is a big part of the economy in western Nebraska, obviously. And so we're trying to conserve groundwater and then also use these projects so that we can maintain that irrigated agriculture dominated economy that we have. Some unique, interesting stats about irrigation in the Republican Basin. In the Republican Basin, about 92% of the irrigated acres are served by groundwater wells. About 8% have surface water rights. And of those surface water irrigated acres, about 5% of the total acres is surface water only. About 3% is commingled surface water and groundwater supplies. But when you look at the compact accounting, 34% roughly of the historical consumptive use occurs in the surface water system, just because of, in large part, the evaporation off the reservoirs, which, as long as there's water in the reservoirs, there's going to be a pretty steady amount of evaporation that occurs there. And so why did we choose stream flow enhancement projects? Well, there's nothing like surety, and having the certainty of being able to flip a switch to put a known volume and known quantity of water in the stream. And also because of the control of that timing, we can control when we don't put water in the stream. Any other option that we would choose would put water in the stream. And if we don't need to have compliance, excess water in the stream for compliance, about half to 2/3 of the time, we would be sending Kansas water that we were entitled to use, with not much of a way to manage that. And so by utilizing projects where we can control it away from the stream, the timing, through these pumping plants where we utilize groundwater, we're able to only send additional water when we need to Kansas. That allows Nebraska to use a larger share of its share of the water supply, more fully utilize the allocation that Nebraska has, which benefits the economy in Nebraska. But these projects don't preclude the need to manage groundwater, and I want to emphasize that. In fact, even after we implemented the N-CORPE project, all three of the NRDs in the Republican Basin that are part of the N-CORPE project actually tightened its rules and regulations with respect to how much groundwater could be pumped in those NRDs. Here on this slide, you can see that there's about 22,000 acres in our district and 37,000 or so in the Middle Republican and about 46,000 acres in that rapid response area. And those are the wells that are right next to the river that have a pretty high and immediate impact on stream flow. And those are the wells that make the most sense to regulate. Now, we chose that option because it had the least economic impact on the area if we had to do that. But I think it was the intent of all the districts to never actually have to utilize those regulations and to focus on building projects so that we could manage the water rather than regulate in that fashion. And that caused a little bit of unrest, but if we didn't have those mechanisms in place, we wouldn't have been able to have guaranteed to the court that we had the ability to comply regardless of what we faced moving forward. And so I think that was a big piece of the IMPs that ultimately in the court helped us be successful against Kansas's litigation. And I believe there it goes. Thought it was froze up there for a minute. So we have about 100,000 acres that we could also regulate in each of the NRDs, and this was something fairly similar to what the Kansas remedy that they proposed in litigation would be. And the difference in the number of acres really strives from when you retire acres or permanently retire irrigation and then don't do any administration of surface water. Instead of roughly 100,000 acres total in the basin that would need to be shut off, you have to do about 3 times that much if you're going to shut off acres permanently long term and not actually do any administration to see that Kansas receives the water that you've taken that regulatory action for. And so if we were to go with retirement of irrigated acres to comply as an alternative, and if we didn't have in the IMPs any administration of that water through the system for Kansas, we'd have to do about 3 times as much retirement. And that cost is about $300 million if you paid fair market price for it in the Republican Basin for just 100,000 acres per district. And so that's really, a large part of why we develop augmentation projects. And augmentation's not a new thing. It's certainly not something that we invented or developed it. They do it all over the West. Colorado does a lot of augmentation, maybe a little bit different than what we're doing here, but basically, over the course of time, when a resource is developed, the easy things are developed first. The shallow wells, the surface water diversions where they take water and use it right next to the stream. And over the course of time, as those uses are all met, then they start with deeper wells and taking water further from the stream, developing infrastructure. And, eventually you kind of run out of things that you can do with the water supply you have in terms of developing, and then to come up with new water, you then have to become more efficient. Take some of your inefficiently used water and use that, change the time and the location of it. And so management of that water to create new and better uses is what augmentation allows. And we're looking out for existing uses. We're converting existing ET to stream flow, managing the time and location of water, and by doing that, and not exceeding historical consumptive use or timing the location and use of water such that we don't harm existing uses, protects those other users that are out there in the system. The N-CORPE project began being developed in late 2012. We thought we had a couple years to get things done, and 2012 was so darn dry that at the end of 2012, when the department was doing some initial forecasting, they said, you guys could need to do something next year. Now, fortunately, we had the Rock Creek project that was operational in 2013. We had some litigation that was filed that slowed up the financing of the project, and so it wasn't able to be brought online in late 2013, but it was early 2014 when we were finally able to bring it online. But things moved pretty fast because the land was for sale. There were other offers being made trying to parse up the property. And so we stepped in fairly quickly. About a week after we knew that it was on the market, we had already made an offer and ultimately ended up getting it under contract. When you walk into a bank in Imperial, Nebraska and say, I need $83 million and I need it by Friday, you get a pretty blank look from a 30-something-year-old ag lender. But fortunately, we had a lot of good people working on it, and they all made it happen. But the concept wasn't new. We had already studied the concept, and this slide illustrates about 8 locations that we looked at back in 06 and 07, where we were looking at potential augmentation sites. And we looked all over the place, and we looked at some places really close to Kansas, down here at the lower end of the basin, on site number 8. And what we really kind of found out, though, was, you can't go somewhere where the aquifer doesn't have a lot of water and won't yield a lot of water. Low capacity wells, that's going to require a lot of infrastructure, a larger footprint. So we needed to go to a place that had a lot of water and had a big block of contiguous irrigation or existing use to be able to retire. And so kind of what we figured out from that study was, you better find the right piece of property, find one that's for sale in a location that works, and don't miss your opportunity to purchase it unless you want to have to go through a very complex and lengthy condemnation process to line up enough contiguous land with existing water uses to retire. And this project was probably the most optimal project for something of this size, and sort of fell into our lap at just the right time. There's about 20,000 acres on the property. About 16,000 of the acres were irrigated. As I mentioned before, about 115 center pivots. And it's again in an area where there's 400 to 600 feet of saturated thickness in mostly sands. And we put that project together. Again, it was delayed from litigation, but we needed water to be running roughly by early to mid-March at the very latest, to be able to meet the quantities of water that we needed to for compact compliance last year. And as you can see here, we finally had a little bit of water coming out of the system at the end of February in 2014, so we just made it. Had a lot of challenges in putting the project in, construction over the winter, but all in all, things went really smooth, and we had a good team of experts, engineers, and attorneys that helped guide us through things, and certainly didn't ever really have any trouble getting people to go the extra mile to get things done. And so what we have now in the basin is, with our Rock Creek project and the N-CORPE project, we could deliver as much as 80,000 acre feet of water in any given year through augmentation. Now, we shouldn't ever have to do that much, but we could. The cost between the two projects is $144 million. As you can see, the N-CORPE project's a little bit more expensive. That's what happens when corn stays at $6 for a couple more years before you buy the land. All of a sudden it costs $1,000 or $2,000 an acre more than it would have otherwise. But those two projects kept about 23,000 acres from being shut off in 2013 and over 300,000 in both 2014 and will in 2015, the N-CORPE project alone. And there's just a shot of some of the 42-inch main line. They had about 7 miles of that strung out at one time when they were getting started delivering it. Something that doesn't maybe get mentioned enough is that the other thing that these management projects can accomplish is there's benefits to the other water users in the basin as well. If we went with regulation and shut off all the groundwater pumping near the stream or even away from it, in the first year in our district, it would have produced about 3,000 acre feet of water according to the groundwater model. And so for the state to be in compliance, the little bit of water that is available for surface water use would have to be regulated away even more than it has to be with these projects in shepherding it through. And so the amount of water that they were able to use or store in 2013 and 2014 would have basically been zero instead of what they had to make up for that lag of groundwater. And then that water would come in on the backside. So by utilizing these management projects, they're, just in and of themselves and the way that they operate, makes the surface water situation in the system better immediately as opposed to years down the road. And I think there's even ways that in the future that we can utilize these projects with their excess capacity to actually look at some conjunctive management opportunities that aren't necessarily aimed at compact compliance, more of just overall management of the system for the existing users. And those are certainly some things that we look forward to being able to look at and work on through the Bureau's conjunctive management study and a conjunctive management study that we had started with the department. And how did we make it all work? Well, it really starts with DNR and our involvement with them in developing integrated management plans. The forecasting methods that we had to have as a state to figure out how to comply, that tell us how much we need to do, the development of those, and all the litigation that we had been through really kind of settled on what our need was. And then there was the financing, which was no small task. The design of the project, like I said, we were first talking about this in September and October, and kind of getting the project or property acquired the first part of November. And I think the final paperwork was signed the 1st of December. And we wanted to have the project operational by September. So we had a 9-month window for design and construction. Now that seems like a tall task, but from the time we started till the time we completed, once we did get rolling, we could do it in actually less time than that. So, all in all, there were a lot of things that worked against us, but we were able to make it work. And if I had a crystal ball looking forward, we're waiting on a decision from the United States Supreme Court. And if they implement the special master's recommendation, instead of having 20,000 to 40,000 acre feet to make up, like we have the last 3 years, it's averaged 23,000 acre feet the last 3 years that we needed to make up in the forecast. That number will likely be something like an average of 7,000 acre feet if the special master's recommendation would be implemented by the court. And so I don't want to jinx that, but I think that puts us in a very good position moving forward. Should we get that late Christmas present, we'll have a need on an average basis, when we need to take any action at all, that's so much smaller than what we had to deal with the last 2 or 3 years, that we'll have about 4 to 5 times more capacity than what we would need moving forward. So the Republican Basin's in a very good position moving forward for compliance. And again, that what I would go back to is those projects then may be able to be used for conjunctive management purposes that aren't related to compact compliance as we move forward in time. And so that's pretty exciting. It might be 3 or 4 years before we can get some of those things in place, but we're certainly in a different place in the Republican Basin than we were even just a couple years ago. So with that, there's just going to be some clips that we had taken during construction that are going to play in the background while I field any questions that folks might have. Any questions?
And agriculture, when it started 4 years ago?
No. The value of water and irrigation in western Nebraska is so high. It was never, not that subsidies and higher prices didn't incentivize irrigation, but we're so efficient with irrigation and so productive with water in with today's technologies that the value of water isn't just from the price of corn as a result of subsidies. Even as prices are lower today, irrigation is far more profitable than dryland farming in western Nebraska.
Jasper, did I understand you that you're going to reduce the allocations from 13, 12, and 9 to 5.9, 4.8, and 3.6 inches.
Jim, those allocations are what would have been required if we wanted to accomplish what we can accomplish with augmentation projects for compliance through district-wide regulation. We would have had to have had a 60% reduction in pumping in allocations to achieve compact compliance if we chose to regulate in that method for compact compliance.
Are you considering reducing allocations still?
Oh, yeah, we've even reduced our allocations and how much water people can use in a given period of time in all three districts, even since we constructed N-CORPE. I expect that moving forward into the future, that those allocations will continue to be ratcheted down as they have over the course of time to today. As we develop new technologies and the ability to use less water in irrigated agriculture, I think the boards will keep ratcheting that down to match what technology will allow us to thrive with. Yes?
I don't know where you're getting the idea that the NRDs have implemented more stringent pumping requirements.
I pump in the lower Republican NRD, and ours was actually increased with the hard cap. And so we could pump more water last year than we ever could in the past on a year-to-year basis. And this was only achieved by taking the stream flows from all the surface water users that amounted to about 100,000 acres. It's understandable why you say that it's cheaper than leasing surface water when the surface water can be taken with no compensation. But I don't know where you're coming up with the idea that pumping is reduced, because the hard caps actually increased the pumping over what we've done in the past.
Yeah, I suppose there are some individuals that when they're faced with a hard cap decide to use it if they're going to lose it. Most farmers are pretty conservative and in light of tighter allocations become more conservative. And I can't speak for the lower Republicans specifically as well as I can our district, but in our district we put for the first time ever a limitation on the 5-year average in terms of how much water they can even use of water they hadn't previously used their allocation. And those have a far larger effect on the overall use in our district than reducing our allocation 1 or 2 inches would have, because it impacts the water users in our district that are above average water users in the district, more so than it does the guys who don't use the full allocation anyway. And so we had a bigger impact on water usage by changing some of those rules and regulations than we would have by reducing our allocation an inch or 2.
Are you going to comment on anything on the only way you can make N-CORPE work is by taking all the surface water and bypassing those inflows past the historic water users?
Well, the state is administering the same volume of water that we're putting into the river through to Kansas. So they're not, while there may be some timing issues and location issues, the volume of water that's administered and not allowed to be used by surface water users is approximately the same volume of water that these projects are putting into the river. So in net sum, there is no taking of surface water by these projects.
If the taking is up front though, if the water isn't available to surface water users until September, and all the source water that should have been available to be stored in the reservoirs for use in pumping in the summer has gone downstream, you don't get any benefit, even though the same amount of water might be available. You've missed an irrigation season.
But certainly we could operate the system more efficiently than it has been to date. There would be opportunities that we've talked about before about if we had more time to store water in a surface water structure from these projects so they could be released on the front end. And I think those are the types of conjunctive management opportunities that I spoke of that I think as we move forward in time we'll be able to take advantage of and make things better in the basin for everyone than they have been over the last few years. Yes.
your slide, you said that currently the plat is not fully allocated. Because you're, under your benefits, you're saying that you're going to fully allocate the plat surface waters, right?
No, the plat basin has areas that are over appropriated, and they have responsibilities to return that over appropriated portion of the plat basin to a fully appropriated status.
Because the groundwater mound that you guys are hoping to pull off of, is that water is derived from canals from Platte River diversions, right?
That's a large part of that mound was created by the plat diversions and leakage from those canals, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wonder, what is the ratio of the piped water to the savings that you get from non-irrigating those acres?
Well, that would vary from year to year because
On average, what is
on average, you know, if we don't exceed historical consumptive use, it's going to be a 1-to-1. But some years we'll pump 3 or 4 times that much, and other years we'll pump 0.
Can you address the funding of this? Is this funded only by counties and the area of the state?
Oh,
Is this funded by the whole state?
well, we've received some state assistance. You know, I won't say the state hasn't given us anything. They've given us all the departments work with us and provided as much funding as they could with what they had to work with. But the lion's share has been, you know, funded by the NRDs, and it's funded through the occupation tax authority that we have. So only the irrigators in the basin are paying for that. We assess a $10, up to a $10, and it's been $10 for several years, tax on irrigated acres throughout the basin. So the irrigators throughout the basin are the ones that are footing the bill for these projects.
Any more questions for Jasper? Any further comment, Jasper?
No, I think it's been a very successful project that's kept the state in compliance when we otherwise wouldn't have been able to the last years. And like I said before, I think the Republican Basin's in a much better place than it's been in recent history for certain. So, thank you.
Let's thank Jasper for coming to speak with us today.